So yesterday, Adam Schefter was talking a little bit about some of the quarterbacks that are going to become free agents over the next season. And one of the guys he talked about was Sam Darnold. And he apparently thinks the Las Vegas Raiders are a realistic option for Sam Darnold. I want you guys to listen to this, and we're going to talk about this on the other side.
What else is going on that we need to know beyond what is happening here in New Orleans?
Well, Greeny, it's always about the quarterbacks in the offseason. It'll be no different this offseason, and we'll start in Pittsburgh with Russell Wilson. Returning to Pittsburgh is a possibility, despite the fact that many have speculated that it's not likely. There have been ongoing conversations between Russell Wilson and the organization about what to do in the future. That doesn't mean it will work out. Clearly, he's scheduled to become a free agent, but returning to Pittsburgh remains a possibility for Russell Wilson, as it does for Justin Fields, the other quarterback. The Steelers have made it very clear they'd like to bring back one of those two quarterbacks. They've spoken to Russell. They'll be talking to Justin Fields, but there will be a market for Justin Fields, a number of teams interested in him, and we'll see whether or not that includes Pittsburgh in his future. Maybe the marquee quarterback this offseason is Sam Darnold, the Minnesota Vikings quarterback. The Vikings have said that they'd like to bring him back, but that is not going to be cheap. The franchise tag remains an option, and one team that I would watch with Sam Darnold moving forward would be the Las Vegas Raiders. I think at some point in time, they're likely to have some interest in trying to bring Sam Darnold to Las Vegas. We'll see if they can make that happen. And the New York Jets have a new coaching staff, a new head coach, a new general manager, and oftentimes when teams have new regimes, that means new players. And that's why there are a lot of people across the league who believe that the signs point to Aaron Rodgers not being back in New York, though this issue is far from decided at this point in time. But it would not surprise a lot of people if Rodgers winds up moving on and going elsewhere. He also has to decide whether or not he even wants to play. That's the first question. But if and when he does that, we'll see where that future takes him, Greeny.
So there you guys have it, right? Adam Schefter is basically putting it out there that one team to watch for Sam Darnold and potentially bringing him in is the Las Vegas Raiders. Of course, everybody knows the Raiders need a quarterback, and the Raiders have made significant changes from last year to this year where things are just different, right? You bring in Tom Brady and you really let this guy kind of control the narrative. You let this guy make some of those decisions that we ultimately made, right? Tom Telesco did a pretty good job, but Tom Brady felt that John Spytek would be even better than Tom Telesco. And the Raiders fired arguably our best general manager we've had in the last 4 or 5. Right? Truth be told, Tom Telesco crushed last year's draft, and we still ended up firing him. And that was most likely due to what Tom Brady kind of had to, say in his influence to Mark Davis. And to me, I think Tom Brady knows what he's doing, and I think Tom Brady and the Raiders are going to really take it to a whole nother level. And of course, we've kind of been doing that, right? We got a Super Bowl winning head coach in Pete Carroll. That was a really, really, really solid hire by the Raiders. You bring in Chip Kelly, who knows how to coach offense, right? He's kind of the opposite of Pete in terms of one coach's offense, one coach's defense. And with a guy like Chip Kelly, what you're doing is you're putting a guy in that has actually installed an offense and actually has had success. We talked about this last offseason. If you guys have been around and have watched this channel at that point. I talked about this multiple times with Wilkins. The guy had never properly installed an offense. Again, when he was with the Bears, it was the first time he had ever done it, and he failed at it. He came to the Raiders. It was the second time he was going to be able to do it, and he failed once again at installing an offense. And remember, installing an offense is different than calling plays, right? It's two completely different things. When you're installing an offense, you're basically telling your wide receivers that, hey, we're going to run these route concepts, and you have to be able to, make some sort of adjustment based on the defensive backs at 5 yards or 7 yards. You got to release outside, right? Mandatory outside releases versus you got to mandatorily go right in front of a safety, and you got to be able to, if it's middle of the field open or middle of the field closed, figure out all of these different things. And these are parts of installing an offense. And Luke Etsy had failed at that with the Bears. And he once again failed with the Raiders. But we have Chip Kelly now, who has had success at installing offenses. This guy's done it 4 or 5 different times, different teams, right? Oregon, the Eagles, the Niners, UCLA, and then last year, of course, with Ohio State. And now he'll have an opportunity with the Raiders. And, if the Raiders had Sam Darnold last year, he would have probably filled with the Las Vegas Raiders. But this year, it could be a little bit different, right? This year, the Raiders can actually have success with Sam Darnold as their quarterback because of that coaching staff. And of course, Patrick Graham will be calling plays on the defensive side. We'll see how he kind of works with Pete Carroll. I think the defense will be elite this year for the Raiders, of course, depending on the free agents and which guys we bring back, which we'll talk about here a little bit later on. But Adam Schefter's putting it out there that the Raiders are a team to kind of keep an eye on. And remember, Sam Darnold, you're not trading first-round picks for this guy. Sam Darnold is going to be a free agent coming up. So unless the Minnesota Vikings decide, hey, we're going to franchise tag Sam Darnold, this guy's free to walk. And the thing with the Vikings, if you franchise tag Sam Darnold, is once you tag him, you owe him money, and it's guaranteed, right? You're going to take a cap hit even if you end up trading him. And one of the things to note with a guy like Sam Darnold is the Vikings didn't have a plan 2 years ago that, hey, we're going to have Sam Darnold and we're going to pay him $50 million. They didn't have that in mind, right? That was not something the Vikings had planned for. When the Vikings paid Justin Jefferson, when they paid Christian Darrisaw, when they paid Jonathan Grenard, they did not have the mindset that we're paying all these guys basically top 5 money at their positions. They didn't think that we're going to have to pay a quarterback $40-50 million. They thought we would have J.J. McCarthy, we'd have a rookie quarterback, and we can support all these big contracts with the rookie quarterback. And that obviously ended up not kind of happening with Sam Darnold coming out of nowhere. My point in saying that is the Vikings aren't really, they haven't really planned to pay a quarterback that type of money. Like, their cap dollars are kind of all over the place. They're not in a good spot to ultimately do that. So it would be interesting to see Sam Darnold actually end up with the Vikings. I think it's a real chance he's not going to end up with the Vikings. And that means for the Raiders, you might be able to bring in Sam Darnold via a free agency contract. Now, of course, the unfortunate thing with Sam Darnold right now is it's going to cost a lot of money. And the Raiders aren't in a great spot when it comes to their cap space. We'll talk about that in literally like 2 or 3 minutes. But I want to just kind of hone on this point, right? Adam Schefter put it out there. The Jets aren't bringing back Aaron Rodgers. Justin Fields will have a legit market. And of course, the Raiders keep an eye on Sam Darnold. And the fact that we brought in Tom Brady and these coaches, things are just different this year. We're going to get a quarterback. It's just a matter of figuring out who it is. But I also want to shift and talk a little bit about why the Eagles won the Super Bowl yesterday. Wow, it was a great day for all of us. And more than why the Eagles won, I want to talk about the plan that the Raiders should have as we kind of go forward, right? Because the Eagles have basically put the blueprint out there for the last 10 years, right? They've literally been doing it, and they've been to 3 Super Bowls in the last 10 years, and they've won 2 of those 3 Super Bowls. And it's not having a great quarterback, right? Truth be told, they won a Super Bowl with system quarterbacks. The first time it was Nick Foles. The second time it was Jalen Hurts. Both times, I guess, right? The last 2 times. The first time Hurts lost. But this past year, Hurts ended up winning the Super Bowl. To me, system quarterbacks can win Super Bowls. But you got to build that roster out. You got to have an elite O-line, an elite D-line. You got to build the trenches out. To me, and I cover the Philadelphia Eagles on the Football Scout channel. I've watched probably every single one of their games this year. Their O-line and D-line is elite. And it's not just starters, right? Like, everybody knows who Mekhi Becton is at this point, right? But even their backup, like, they have a backup in Tyler Steen, who's a pretty solid guard. I think he was a 3rd-round pick. Don't quote me on that, but he was a 2nd-year player this past season. He's legit. He's going to be their starter once Becton leaves after this season. To me, the Eagles have a legit plan, and even on the defensive side. Jordan Davis was a 1st-round pick. He's a rotational player for the Eagles. You got a guy in Josh Sweat, who I believe was a 4th-round pick, and he's just developed, and they've kept this guy around. After it took him 5-6 years to develop, they've kept him around, and he had 2.5 sacks yesterday. Jalen Carter, everybody knows Jalen Carter, but people don't know Milton Williams. People don't know the other rookie defensive end, Hunt, or Nolan Smith, right? People don't know a lot of these different guys that the Eagles have. But the Eagles have a good pass rush. And I think when you're the Raiders, you have a similar pass rush to the Philadelphia Eagles. Like, you can make the argument the Raiders have, it's a little bit different, right? They have Jalen Carter. We don't have Jalen Carter. But we have Maxx Crosby, and they don't have Maxx Crosby, right? So you can make the argument the Raiders' defensive line it's similar to the Eagles if it's fully healthy. To me, if you think about putting a guy like Maxx Crosby, Malcolm Koonce, Adam Butler, Christian Wilkins as your 4 starting defensive linemen, that's an elite defensive line, right? That is an absolute elite defensive line. Obviously, they got to be healthy. That doesn't include guys like Clavon Chasen or Tyree Wilson as the backups. And it also doesn't include any other guy you might bring in this offseason. But let's talk about it, man. If the Raiders can actually revamp that defensive line, and you got to bring Koonce back, you got to bring Chasen back, and then even Adam Butler. But then even more than that, you got to think about who's that other defensive tackle, right? If it is Adam Butler, who's number 3? right? Aiden, if you don't bring back Koonce or Chase on, who's that guy opposite of Maxx? Maybe it's Abdul Carter with the 6th overall pick, but for the Raiders to beat the Chiefs, and we kind of did this the one time we did beat them last year. The Raiders got after Patrick Mahomes, and we made it very, very, very hard for Patrick Mahomes. And the Eagles have kind of done that this entire season, where they've gotten after the opposing quarterbacks. And again, it's not just the defensive line, but I start with the defensive lineman first because the Raiders have a good defensive line, right? At least they have a group of guys that you can rely on going into this next season. Now, the unfortunate thing for the Raiders is it is going to be very, very expensive. And I just want to show you guys why the Raiders are in a kind of an interesting spot. First and foremost, the Raiders have 27 free agents, right? You guys can see the list of free agents right here. And this is going to cost a lot of money, right? Believe it or not, these 27 free agents, yeah, we have 95 million in cap space. I think that's the updated number. But just on a low estimate, and I kind of put these numbers in here really quickly. Just on a low estimate, it's going to cost you 89 million to basically bring all of these guys back. Now, the yellow is just kind of guesses that I had right. Like, for example, Malcolm Koonce, I think, would cost somewhere around 13 million on a low estimate. Trayvon Merrick, 13 on a low. Adam Butler, 7 on the low. Nate Hobbs, 5 on the low. Spillane, 7 on the low, right? So just considering these guys in yellow, I kind of just did some low estimates. And then every single one of these other guys down here in green, these are just what we paid them this past season, right? Just be very conservative. Take the number they had last year, bring them back. Now, keep in mind, you can replace any of these guys, right? Like Alexander Madison could be replaced with any other running back. Keep in mind, it's going to still cost you $2 million, whatever running back it is you bring in. You can replace Isaiah Pola-Mao, but the actual positional value, right? The actual guy you bring in is still going to cost you $985,000. No matter who it is, the player does not matter. Right? At the bare minimum, you got to fill that roster spot. A backup cornerback's going to still cost you $985,000. On the very, very, very low end, we're looking at $89 million for just kind of replacing some of these guys. And keep in mind, right? Like, sure, you can let a guy like Trayvon Merrick or a guy like Malcolm Koonce walk. Realistically, you could probably let one of these guys walk. You have to figure out how you're going to replace them. But ideally, Trayvon Merrick's a top 5 safety. Malcolm Koonce is a top 10 pass rusher, or at least he looked like it in that back half of those 9 games. These are guys you would want to bring back. They're homegrown talents for the Raiders. This is why the Ravens have so much success, because the guys that show upside, they retain those guys, right? And these guys have shown upside. Nate Hobbs, another guy. On the low end, I put him at 5 million. But chances are these guys are actually going to end up getting a lot more than some of these low ends, right? You can see the high end is going to cost 141 million. Obviously, that's probably not realistic for the Raiders. But the Raiders are going to have to make some tough decisions, right? Like, if you want to keep an elite defensive line and you want to keep an elite defense, you got to bring back these top 5 guys, right? You have to bring back Koonce and Merrick and Butler and Hobbs and Spillane. Those are starters right there for the Raiders. It's going to cost us money. And the thing is even if you placed every other guy with rookie players, it's still going to cost you a ton of money. And I think for the Raiders, if you're going to go down that route and you're going to pay Sam Darnold, it's not realistic, right? If you're going to pay Sam Darnold $40 million, you're going to end up losing out on some of these guys. So it'll be up to John Spytek to really figure it out, right? Really figure out that mixture of which way you want to kind of go. Now, you could probably save some money cutting guys like Gardner Minshew. You could probably save money by trading Jacoby Myers, although I wouldn't be for it. You could, if you really wanted to save some money, you could go down those paths. Or you can just let guys like Robert Spillane walk and kind of draft his replacement. You could probably let Nate Hobbs walk. Obviously, I love Hobbs. I think he's a really, really good slot defender. But it makes sense, right, if you don't want to pay him that type of money. But the Raiders will have to figure out on the defense side. And again, I do think our defense line's elite, right? I really do think that. But I want to kind of switch and talk a little bit about what else the Raiders have to do this offseason to be legit, right? I think the Raiders got to fix their offensive line. And some people will disagree with me when I say this, but the Raiders' offensive line still is not very good, right? I hope you guys watched the Super Bowl yesterday and watched a really good offensive line in the Philadelphia Eagles. That's the best offensive line in the NFL. The Raiders are nowhere near that. The Philadelphia Eagles go out there with 5 offensive linemen and they run 4 guys downfield. The Raiders have 2 guys running downfields. They have 5 offensive linemen. They have 2 tight ends chipping. They have a running back chipping. Right? They got to help out those offensive linemen because those offensive linemen cannot 5-man pass protect. So the Raiders have two guys running downfield. It makes it hard for the quarterback to actually be able to, push the ball downfield. So we got to revamp our offensive line so we can get to the point where we can 5-man pass protect. And the thing is the Raiders do have two guys that I think are long-term, they're here. They're not going anywhere. Right? Colton Miller, I think, is like 28, 29 years old. Paris Johnson is like 21. Those two guys should be the future for at least the next 5 years for the Raiders. And they're going to be really good football players for the next 5 years. But you got to figure out the left guard, right tackle position. Some people mentioned when I talked a little bit about this on Twitter earlier, or yesterday, late yesterday, earlier today. Some people said, should the Raiders, go forward with Jordan Meredith? Should we bring this guy back? He's a pending free agent this year. And then what about Mekhi Becton or Trey Smith? Should we bring these guys in, right? These guys are bullies. It could probably help this offensive line. And, I wouldn't mind paying a guard, but the thing with a guy like Trey Smith is it's going to cost us $20 million. To me, that's not money the Raiders realistically have, right? Especially as you kind of just go down that chart that we kind of looked at, which, you got 27 roster spots. Just filling out the bottom 20 is going to still cost us $40 million. And then, Koonce and Merrick and Butler and Hobbs and Spillane can each cost us $10 million easily. It doesn't make sense that we go down this path of paying guards. All right, Trey Smith's a really good guard, as is Mekhi Becton, but it just doesn't make sense to pay these guys. It's going to cost us too much money. In fact, this draft that's coming up with offensive linemen, specifically interior offensive linemen, this is the best one that we've had, I think, in the last 20 years. I really think the interior offensive line is the best we've had in the last 20 years. And I think if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, there's a couple different things you can do as the draft approaches. So if you decide we're not going to pay Malcolm Koonce, you can target a guy like Abdul Carter. Maybe it's a guy like Mike Green, right? And there's a couple other defensive ends you can potentially target in the top 10. I think the Tennessee defensive end's very, very solid as well. James Pierce Jr. I'd probably put Pierce Jr. ahead of Mike Green at this point. But those guys are all very, very, very solid. And you can even take Pierce Jr. as the first defensive end, truth be told. All right, 6'5", 260, the movement, it's elite, right? You can move off of Malcolm Koonce and take one of these other defensive ends with pick 6. Abdul Carter might not be there, right? There's a chance he ends up going in the top 4. He might go number 1 overall. We don't really know. Which means if that actually ends up happening, if Abdul Carter goes and you decide let's move off of Malcolm Koonce, let's save that 13 to 18 million. And keep in mind, Spytek actually thinks Malcolm Koonce's value this year is $20 million. That's the contract he's going to get. $18 million for Koonce makes him the 16th highest paid defensive end. Right, the defensive end position gets like the top guys get 25 and north. And Koonce would have gotten that if he was healthy, I think, this year. So if the Raiders let Koonce walk, right, and you go the route of let's get a guy with the 6th pick, I would be okay with that. But I think what makes more sense for the Raiders would be maybe you get your future right tackle at pick 6. And you say let's pay Koonce and let's skip out on a defensive end and you pay your future right tackle, or you get your future right tackle pick 6. I think there's two guys that'll probably be options at pick 6. I think Josh Carnley and Josh Simmons Jr. I think both of those guys were still options at pick 6 if you want an offensive tackle. Some people say Josh Carnley had a really bad Senior Bowl. I spoke a little bit in more detail about Josh Connerly, and I'll link a video down in the comments below. I posted this on the Football Scout channel where I spoke about all the guys that stood out to me. Connerly was one of those guys, right? I think when it's all said and done, Connerly will still end up being a top 10 to 15 pick. And, of course, Josh Simmons, the other guy at Ohio State, I really, really liked his tape. Very, very good mover. I think he's another guy you can consider with pick 6. I think there's a wild card in Anthony Belton as being a guy that you might be able to take with pick 6. I think he can play tackle, but to be honest, I'd probably take Belton in the 2nd round and put him at guard. And I think if you're the Raiders, you can go down whatever pick you want with the 6th pick. But I think it's very important. You got to get 2 new guards. Very, very, very important. You got to shore up the offensive line. Charles Grant is a guy that I would take in the 2nd round. Anthony Belton is a guy I take in the 2nd round. Those two guys right there are going to be top 5 guards. Guarantee you it right now. Anthony Belton, Charles Grant will be top 5 guards. And that's if they play guard, right? Some teams might take them and actually put them at offensive tackle. That could obviously happen as well. But I would not be surprised if those guys play guard. And for the Raiders, as a 2nd round pick, that gives you a top 5 guard. That gives you a people mover right there, right? And sometimes people overlook this fact. There's guys like Mekhi Becton who move people out of gaps. And then there's guys like Jordan Meredith who hold gaps, right? They make contact with these D tackles and they hit them and they extend themselves up. And no one's moving. There's no lane that's developing. A running back has to be able to squeeze through the gap. And then you got guys like Mekhi Becton that take that defensive tackle and they take them 7 yards that way. There's people movers and there's people holders. And I think for the Raiders, you got to get people movers on the inside because right now, Dylan Parham, Jordan Meredith, they're holders, man. These guys are not moving people out of gaps. So the Raiders got to get guys that can move people. And I think that's going to allow us to actually have a legit offensive line that can have success running the football. Charles Grant, Anthony Belton, these are people movers. And if I'm the Raiders, I'm considering both of these guys. You can go down the whole of, hey, let's target a guy in round 3 or 4. Wyatt Milliams, a guy you could probably get in like the 4th round. I would consider him there. Maybe even 3rd round if you really, really wanted to bring him in. Gray Sable was the best offensive lineman at the Senior Bowl. He's a guy you could probably get in the 3rd round as well. He's really good. He might go in the 2nd, but he's still an interior offensive lineman, so I'd try getting him later on. Jonah Savannah out of Arizona. Torrey Simpkins out of South Carolina is a guy to keep an eye on, man. I think Simpkins is going to be a really, really, really good offensive lineman. He was at the Hula Bowl. Loved his tape. The last couple things the Raiders got to do, man, is you got to get a wide receiver. So if you don't get an offensive tackle with pick 6, if you don't go the defensive end route, right? Maybe you go with DJ Glaze this year. Maybe you bring in Malcolm Koonce back, right? You bring him back. Maybe you go and get a wide receiver with pick 6. Tetro McMillan out of Arizona. Travis Hunter might actually be there with pick 6. It's not guaranteed he goes in the top 5, especially if you get 1 or 2 quarterbacks to go. Maybe Will Johnson, maybe McMillan goes before Travis Hunter. I would line Travis Hunter up as a full-time wide receiver. And that's exactly what the Raiders need. You need a full-time wide receiver, a guy that can actually play that position. Maybe it's McMillan, maybe it's Hunter. Maybe you try making cap space. Maybe you say instead of Trayvon Merrick, instead of paying Merrick $19 million, which would make him the 3rd highest paid safety, maybe you take that 19 and you give it to Amari Cooper. Maybe you take that 19, add another 7 or 8, right, by moving Jacoby Myers, and you get T. Higgins instead, right? The Raiders have options. You just got to figure out how you're going to kind of go down this route. And of course, the quarterback position will be the one to really figure out. And I want to just wrap it up with this. Jalen Hurts coming into the NFL was not a starter for the Philadelphia Eagles. He was not a 1st-round pick. He was a 2nd-round pick. I think he was like the 15th pick in the 2nd round. He came in and he's been to 2 Super Bowls. But the thing is they built a team around Jalen Hurts. They have this ideology, right? They're going to run the football, be physical, and run people over. And we're going to dominate the trenches. And the Eagles have stuck with it, and it's worked. The Raiders are not that far away from it. We got to fix the offensive line. Got to bring in a new guard. You got to figure out the right tackle position. Maybe bring in 2 guards. And then you just got to really bring back the guys on the defensive line, right? Koonce, maybe it's Chason, maybe it's Adam Butler. Just got to figure it out. The quarterback could be Sam Darnold. You can go down the route of Aaron Rodgers for a year and Jalen Milroe or one of these other quarterbacks in the 2nd round as well, right? Quarterback doesn't matter as much, in my opinion, as O-line, D-line, because that's the way you can always have success. Of course, if you want the next Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, you got to take a guy in the top 10, but you don't have to go down that route. All right, so we'll see what ends up happening. Let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.